Every writer knows that the best conversations about writing don't happen in classrooms, or symposia, or any other fancy artisanal setting. They happen at the bar, usually after deadline. That's the vibe we're going for here. This is The Other 51, conversations with writers of all genres about writing. I'm Brian Moritz. Today's guest is Baxter Holmes from ESPN. Baxter Holmes, welcome to The Other 51. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
And you probably have better weather than I do since you're in Los Angeles and I'm in upstate New York. I'm just going to guess.
Yeah.
I'm going to guess you don't have snow actively happening right now.
There's no snow on the ground, but it's a little bit chillier than people here would like. But that's all relative to everywhere else.
Right, because you've been around. I know you've been in LA for a few years, but you were in Boston and Oklahoma before, right?
Yeah, I grew up in Oklahoma, in a small town in southeastern Oklahoma. Went to college at OU. Started at the LA Times. Was there for 3.5 years. Then got hired at the Boston Globe to cover the Celtics. Was there for 2 years, and then came back to LA with ESPN, and I've been with them for 3 years and 4 or 5 months, something like that.
All right. Just out of curiosity, what was the town in Oklahoma you grew up in?
Very small. It's a town called Tuskahoma. Not many people have heard of it. I think there's about 80 full-time residents. It's
okay. Wow.
Incredibly tiny. Yeah.
I was going to say, the only small town in Oklahoma I'm at all familiar with is Ada. That's, I don't know. I'm a New York guy. To me, it's all one state, so I don't know how close it is. But my former newspaper publisher worked there before he came to the paper that I worked with him at. He was from Ada, Oklahoma, and I'd like to talk about it a lot. So.
Yeah.
I'm curious, coming from such a small, that's as small towns go, that's small. I'm wondering, how does that, do you think that does that have an impact on your writing, your reporting style, on your career at all? I mean, does that color how you see the world or how you see your job at all?
That's a good question. I've never really thought about it in that way. I was actually born just north of Seattle and lived there for a few years until I think I was about in first or second grade. Then we moved to Oklahoma, where I basically grew up. But we moved around a little bit because of my dad's job when I was little, and I had kind of traveled with him. We did a lot of long road trips as a family, so I never really felt as much as I grew up in a small town that I was, kind of closed off to the rest of the world or whatever the case may be. So, yeah, not necessarily. I mean, I read a lot growing up and started working at the newspaper in a neighboring town when I was 16. And, things kind of took off from there.
Okay. So when I first emailed you to schedule the podcast, I was very excited to talk to you. You've written some of my favorite stories, and we're going to get to them today about NBA players in peanut butter and jelly, NBA players in wine, and I love them both. And you emailed me back and said, yeah, I'd love to do the podcast, but I've got this story coming out this week and I think you're going to like it. And, and sure as heck that dropped, 2 days ago as we're recording this, a story on, the basketball success of Kinston, North Carolina, and it's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful story. I'll throw the link in show notes to it. And just want to talk a little bit about that piece. First of all, where did this idea for the story come from?
Sure. So I covered the Lakers for 3 years for ESPN. When they drafted Brandon Ingram, I naturally wanted to do some kind of story about him, a profile, whatever the case may be. And was researching and saw that he came from a pretty small town that had, for whatever reason, produced a number of NBA players. And so I then became more interested in the town. And then it just kind of snowballed from there. I remember calling Cedric Maxwell, former Celtics great, who is also from that town. And at the end of the interview, I had asked him, is there anything about this town that I would be surprised by or that I wouldn't know. And he mentioned casually that one fact about there was, like a nuclear accident that nearly happened nearby. And so then I started researching that. And then, I convinced my editor to let me go to the town. And one thing kind of led to another, which is how I think a lot of my stories are. It's, one phone call, one question, and then I'll say, tell me a little bit more about that or whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, and then things will I just let my curiosity or whatever guide me, and I have some very good editors who help me out. along the way tremendously. So yeah, that's kind of how that one started.
But what's kind of the overview of the story? Like, why are we talking about Kinston, North Carolina, in terms of the NBA?
Sure. So they produce, as I said, a number of NBA players. From Cedric Maxwell, Jerry Stackhouse, Reggie Bullock, Brandon Ingram, guys like Charles Shackelford and Herbert Hill. But it is a town that has been, subject to some really almost biblical obstacles and tragedy dating back many decades. I opened the story with the story of how two hydrogen bombs fell not far from there and nearly detonated. Then there's economic devastation, which is really, and the town is still tremendously struggling from that. Mm-hmm. They have this river that flows through there that floods at the drop of a hat and, will wipe out, so much of the town nearly every time it does it. And they have, real problems with gang violence. I think their violent crime rate is about double national average, according to the FBI statistics. So, but yet through all of that, they have this incredible basketball tradition. And, the local high school has been to about 21 state championship games. There was a stretch, I think, where the middle school lost only a handful of games, over a period of more than a dozen years. So mm-hmm. It's a remarkable place, for basketball, but it's a town of survival, given everything that it has faced, but basketball is what survives most.
Right. And I know you've mentioned it a few times, but that opening anecdote about the almost nuclear accident is just a striking way to start the story. And so I'm wondering, you kind of mentioned how you learned about it. But kind of tell that story and why'd you decide to lead with that? Why, obviously you put that in the story, but why start there?
Sure. So the first thing I'll say is, in terms of why starting there was, well, actually, I guess I'll back up and explain a little bit of the anecdote, just so listeners have a better understanding in case they haven't read the story. So in 1961, a B-52 bomber carrying two hydrogen bombs sprung a fuel leak, fell apart in midair, and the two bombs fell towards Faro, North Carolina, which is in eastern North Carolina, and they nearly detonated. One of the bombs, their parachute opened and it fell into a trio of gum trees. The other one, its parachute didn't open, so it fell at the speed of sound into a plowed tobacco field, and over a period of many days had to be dug out. And I interviewed the man who was, then 25 and was sent by the Air Force to go find the bombs and defuse them, or disarm them, I should say. And he told me of all the nuclear mishaps that the country has ever had, and they're called broken arrows, when like something with a nuclear bomb goes awry. That was the closest we've ever come to a situation that we would never forget. He said it could have been Bay, North Carolina, had those bombs gone off. I opened the story with that scene just because, I'm always thinking of the reader's attention first and foremost, and how fragile it is, and how it's the easiest thing to keep and to maintain. And, when I heard that story, it stuck with me. When I interviewed the guy and how close it was, to being an unbelievable disaster, I was like, oh, this is kind of a no-brainer to open the story. But in a more poignant way, I kept thinking about how even, the fact that those bombs didn't go off is a miracle, but that the town, it seems, has been almost paying for them in a weird way ever since, right? They've just faced so much tragedy ever since this near biblical disaster. And, part of it, I guess, is just the device of a compelling scene that, a lot of people probably don't know about, that, had it gone off, probably could have sparked World War III. That's something that I think about and have thought about a lot. At the time, we had those B-52s up there because we wanted to be able to attack the Soviets if they attacked us, immediately. And if one of those bombs had gone off, there's a strong chance that we likely would have thought that it was the Soviets for whatever reason, and that we would have then, fired back at them and us, and who knows from there where we'd be today. But in terms of, opening the story there, I just thought it was too compelling, to put anywhere else.
Well, it's a lesson I try to teach a lot of my students too, is like if a story really resonates with you and you think it's cool, I call it the oh cool test because I feel like I have to name it. But it's this idea, like it's something that if I think it's interesting, it should be your story. It should probably be your lead, because if I as the writer think it's interesting, there's probably a chance that you as the reader are going to be as interested on it, by it as well, and kind of drawn into the story by it as well.
Yeah, and look, every time I told that story, whether, to my wife, to friends, to whoever the case may be, the response was always like, "Oh my God." And and from there, people would want to know more. Like, well, what happened next? What became of it? What, everything like that. Even when I was in the town interviewing people, I had mentioned, cause I'd interviewed the gentleman who disarmed the bombs before I went to the town. And I was explaining that story to some of them, and they couldn't believe it. They had known maybe that there was, some kind of nuclear something that had happened, nearby many years ago, but they didn't know that it was a hydrogen bomb, or that there were two of them, or how close they were to going off, and what could have happened from then on. So yeah, I mean, it was a very easy decision. I'll put it that way.
And so you mentioned earlier that you're reporting, especially with this story, but with all your stories, kind of like one thing leads to another, and one call kind of leads to something else. So kind of if it walk through the whole reporting process and how often you were at the town, how long you were there, and kind of the steps and how the story kind of unfolded for you.
Sure. So, after doing a series of phone interviews with various people in the town, and I want to first give a tremendous amount of thanks to a gentleman named Brian Hanks, who was worked at the newspaper there, and is, I think, the basketball announcer for the Kinston basketball team. He had reached out after I did a story about Brandon Ingram and told me that he enjoyed the story. And then I think I had mentioned that I was interested in doing something maybe about Brandon's hometown. And then we started corresponding, and he was so helpful all along the way of, pointing me in the right direction of who might be good to speak with and things of that nature, and especially when I was there. But I went to the town in August of 2016 after doing a series of interviews, and was there for probably 3 days or 4 days. And then it was just a gamut of interviews while I was there. I spent a lot of time with Brian. I spent going around the town, seeing, the factories that, no longer are at their peak, that they once were, seeing a lot of the great gyms that they have and recreation centers, meeting law enforcement. And, when I went there, I initially had thought like, oh, this is a great basketball town. Very interesting. But while I was there, I started to see a bigger picture of a lot of the struggles that the town had faced, particularly with crime, and with, the various floods and things of that nature. But particularly with crime, I would say, when I was sitting with Perry Tyndall, the head basketball coach of the Kinston high school team, and he was telling me how, he has to tell his players, you deserve to grow old, in terms of wanting them to think beyond basketball and not fall into other ways of life there. And, or talking to the sheriff, Ronnie Ingram, Brandon Ingram's uncle, and hearing him say, tell his son, who's a local cop, that, you can't save everybody. Those really stuck with me. And then I started to realize that this was not just a story about, a town that produces a lot of players, but a town that really is in dire straits in some ways, and that basketball is what survives there a lot. So, from there, obviously there's 18 months that separate us between when I was first there and, when the story was published. And I wasn't working on it the whole time during all of that. I covered the Lakers for us. I had a bunch of stories that were in the works. And there was, some upheaval at ESPN, well publicized this last year in terms of number of layoffs and restructuring and things of that nature. So the story got put on hold, for lack of a better term, for some time. But, I was able to get back to it. And we had made a priority of publishing it, I think early this year, which we did. So, but yeah, it was definitely an emotional story, to work on, and, one I'm certainly proud of.
Yeah, the line, and you said it, you deserve to grow old. I mean, that's a gut punch when you read that line.
Yeah, that was, there were a few times during this story where, I just remember sitting back in a chair, if it was an interview in a chair when I was sitting with Perry Tyndall in his office when he was describing that. And it was just quiet for, a few beats. And I couldn't believe that someone would ever have to tell, anyone that you deserve to grow old. Or listening to, and I remember going out after that interview and sitting in my car and I just kind of stared at the windshield for a minute and let that try to sink in and understand that, which I still don't know if I still do. That's just it is such a gut punch, as you mentioned. And then the other line, and then the line from Ronnie Ingram when he told me, about you can't save everybody.
Right.
And just that he was like, I don't know what the answer is. I really don't. I'm not sure what to do. And there was a sense of helplessness. And it really reminded me of No Country for Old Men. And the Tommy Lee Jones character, the sheriff, who crime had, I think he says something along the lines of, crime today, it's hard to take its measure. You just, he was describing how he just couldn't believe how things had escalated, how violent everything had become. And hearing him talk about what had happened in that town was much the same way. So yeah, there were several moments in this story. And then interviewing Stephanie White, the mother of Antonio Hines, who was murdered in the town in the summer of 2016. That was, I talked to her over a period of time, or a few times, and everyone was painful to hear her story. And I'm incredibly grateful to her for sharing it. And I hoped to try to keep the memory of her son alive, given, everything that she's been through. But yeah, it was a difficult story to work on from an emotional perspective, but I felt very honored that these people were willing to open up and very, driven to try to live up to their openness and to share the story in a way that would do justice to everything they've been through and everything the town has been through.
So I'm wondering, if on such an emotional story like this, how do you kind of take care of yourself on that? How do you process all of this heavy material that you're getting, and how do you kind of keep your head right and your head straight? Not even just from a journalist or writing perspective, but just, as a person, as a human being, how did you kind of deal with all that?
That's a good question. I as a journalist, I tend to just compartmentalize, and you try to figure out the facts of what happened and where and how and why and all that, and divorce yourself as much as you can from the other stuff. Certainly, I'm not a robot, and so I'm not immune to it, but, I think so much of when I'm actually writing the story, I'm thinking, okay, what is the natural transition here? How is the story moving along? How, do I need, to pause for a beat here to let this kind of sink in for the reader? So I'm just so engrossed in the story itself and trying to find the most artful, honest way to tell it that I'm probably a little bit divorced from the emotional aspect of it. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't, think about it, before I go to bed and think about what it's like when Stephanie White goes to bed, and, her waiting for some kind of justice or retribution, or the fact that her son is buried in an unmarked grave, and the burden of everything that she goes through, or that the sheriff goes through, or that the high school coach or others in the town go through. I'm not, it's impossible not to think about all of that. But at the time, I'm mostly just thinking about smaller things like, okay, what's my deadline for this story? What's the word count that I need to hit? What's the next section that goes best here? What is the best way to describe this scene? All of those little details. And that keeps me usually pretty busy.
So when you're reporting and like the one thing leads to another and kind of on and on like that, how do you know when you're done?
That's another good question. When I'm reporting, I usually have this kind of pit in my stomach, so to speak. Like there's this, I don't know how to, I don't want to say it feels like I'm sick, but it's not far off from that. And I just report and report and report until I don't feel that anymore, until it feels like I have everything that I could possibly need. And I think what that pit is, honestly, as I've thought about it more, because it's always there, is like that there's a hole somewhere in the story, right? There's some kind of something that hasn't been filled, some question or questions that have been unanswered, or I haven't turned over every possible stone that could yield some incredibly compelling, telling piece of information. And it's only until I do all that, which, in some cases takes dozens and dozens of phone calls and many, many months, on whatever story it is I'm working on. It's not until I feel comfortable in this kind of crippling fear that I'm missing something important, or that I don't have enough to tell the story the way it deserves to be told. It's not until I have all that I know I'm done. Some people say, like, when you interview people and you just keep hearing even new people and you're not getting any new information, they're just repeating the same things. That's certainly true. But in a weird way, like the gut or the pit in my stomach, when I'm reporting, when that starts to fade, I think I usually have enough.
All right. So we've talked about serious stuff. Let's talk peanut butter and jelly, which is serious, of course. And also the wine story that you did recently. I love those stories. They're so much fun. They're so interesting. Look, especially at NBA players. So where did those ideas come from? Where does it come from? Like, yeah, I'm going to write about their love of peanut butter and jelly. How's that come about?
So when I was an intern at the Boston Globe, excuse me, in the summer of 2008, the Celtics were in the finals against the Lakers. And one of the storylines I remember from that summer was that, maybe ESPN did like a little SportsCenter feature or something about it. I can't remember exactly, but, that Kevin Garnett had started them on peanut butter and jelly. And I just thought that was kind of interesting and quaint, as did other news outlets at the time who were writing about it. And I just remembered that. And then when I became a full-time beat writer in the NBA, later at the Boston Globe, interestingly enough, I remember going around the NBA and I kept seeing peanut butter and jelly sandwiches on the pregame, locker room spreads, right?
Okay.
And if you go into opposing locker rooms, you'd see peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And I just thought that was interesting. And then I kept noticing it more and more. And eventually I remember telling one of my bosses, like, I said, it's funny. There's so much money in the NBA. There's so much science and analytics and dietitians and high-tech cameras and all this stuff, but yet there's peanut butter and jelly sandwiches all over the place. I'm not sure why that is, but I'd like to look into it. And they, were on board with it. So that's really where it started. And then, from there, just like anything else, it's one phone. Another thing that's probably true in a lot of my stories is I'm always trying to get to the origin point of something,
right?
Where something exactly began, if it could. And then so I made enough phone calls, and a lot of the mass revolution, or production, I should say, of PB&J in the NBA went back to that moment with Kevin Garnett and the Celtics. And from there, it was trying to figure out, all right, well, who does it? Where did it go from there? Which teams do it? How do they do it? What is the science behind these sandwiches, so to speak? And then also just the element of it's a comfort food, and why it is that what that exactly means, and why players trust peanut butter and jelly when so many things are outside of their control, and a lot of it dates back to childhood, and it's something that's very familiar. It's easy to, it's hard to screw up. So, that's kind of where that one started. And then the wine story, I just kept seeing it, players post pictures on social media or casually mention it in interviews, and, posting pictures from Napa. Dwayne Wade, started a relationship with Paul Meyer Wine in Napa to do, his own label. And it just seemed like something that was more than a side project for a lot of these guys, that it was an intense passion of theirs. And I kind of went from there. I wanted to talk to people in the wine industry to try to figure out, okay, what's your take on these players, and how interested or obsessive they are with wine. And they were really impressed and said that the level of detail and attention to detail that these players were bringing to the table, so to speak, was unlike, a lot of what they'd ever seen, even entertaining celebrities or well-to-do or whoever the case may be. But that these players who are obviously, intense students of the game and break down basketball to a really intricate, incredible level, were doing the same when it came to wine, and asking all kinds of really interesting, detailed questions, from the soil to the weather to fermentation tanks and on and on and on. And so that's kind of where that one started. And then I just, as I try to do, or as I guess it often happens, I just went down the rabbit hole on both that story and, on peanut butter and jelly, and then on another number of other ones. And then came out on the other side when I felt like I had enough to tell the story, the way it at least in a complete way so that people could understand it.
I love the scene in the wine story where I think you're talking to Dwayne Wade and LeBron like starts inching his way over and Wade is like he heard you say wine, he's going to inch his way over, and LeBron totally copped to it and came over and started to talk about it. That was a great moment that you captured there. I'm wondering what it's like when you go up to players and say, I'm doing a story about your peanut butter jelly or about peanut butter and wine, about your wine collection. I mean, are they kind of like, why are you asking me about this? Are they like all in to talk about it?
It's a good question. I guess they've been fine. Like I've never, they might for a second be like, oh, that's kind of, whatever. That's might be a little off or something. I mean, it's different than the usual talk about the game from last night questions. But I think to a lot of players, they find it refreshing that there's a change of pace and whatever they're being interviewed about. And for some of them, it's interesting. They're so incredibly passionate. Like, take Carmelo Anthony at wine, for instance. When I sat down with him, it almost felt like he'd been waiting for someone to interview him about something about this for some time. And so everything just poured out of him. So much. It was an amazing interview. I walked away just saying, my gosh, we could have talked for hours and hours and hours. And in terms of some of the other ones, I think players, like peanut butter and jelly, for instance, I think players had fun with it. In recalling, if it was Brandon Ingram talking about how particular he is and how there has to be like jelly coming out both sides of the sandwich, or that there isn't, I'll say this too. One of the things that was kind of interesting on the peanut butter and jelly one, people were somewhat intense in talking about that because they believed that a lot of people believed that however they had peanut butter and jelly growing up was the only way that peanut butter and jelly should ever be served, and that every other way was disgusting. So people had, like, if people believed in grape jelly, they thought strawberry was the most disgusting thing, or vice versa. And once I had kind of mentioned them, like I'm doing a story kind of about, peanut butter and jellies or the culture of it, it was interesting. Players would be like, oh yeah, that's so true. And they would talk about when I was with this team, they did it a certain way and I didn't really like that, or we didn't like that and we changed it, or in Portland, they toast the bread and they cut it a certain way because that's how Damian Lillard likes it. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm always trying to find an untold story. And a lot of that is just paying attention to something that might be small, but there might be something more there. And you never know. I mean, one of the things I thought will stick with me from the wine story, is this notion that the winemakers had, and I think there's truth to it, that they feel as if there's a corollary between players and wine in terms of the appreciation for how there's so much work that goes into making a bottle of wine that no one will ever see, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's, players live that. That is, they spend all these hours in the gym, and it's basically a lifetime, and then they perform, and they're kind of judged and critiqued intensely, just as wine is. And that there was kind of this appreciation for this process of kind of, all this painstakingly crafted thing that, goes out into the world. And, so yeah, there turned out to be something more there, but, anyways, that's kind of, yeah, that's my approach on those kinds of things.
So how do you find untold stories, especially now in this media age, and you're covering the NBA, which of course has so much media coverage? I mean, how do you find a story that hasn't been told yet?
It's a great question. I'll first say that I had an editor at the LA Times named Steve Padilla, who is, he was the writing coach for the Tribune Company, I think with the recent sale, of the LA Times, or however. I'm not sure how his position works now. Anyways, but he always kind of implored writers to develop a story hunting mindset, to always be on the lookout for stories. And he would work with you on the various ways to do that. If it's, if everyone's looking at the macro, maybe you need to look at the micro, or vice versa. There's a number of things that he would talk about. I think there's actually a list of these things on pointer.com, or pointer.org, if that's the site's name. And, So he was instrumental in that. And then when I was an intern at the Globe, I remember Walter Robinson, famous Spotlight editor portrayed by Michael Keaton in the movie Spotlight. He talked about how there are great ideas all around us, and so often the people might be reaching for the most difficult to reach fruit, like at the top of the tree. And he's like, and that's a worthwhile pursuit. But never forget that there's great stories in front of you all the time. And so I'm constantly thinking of that, like what, and as I think of that, something that I'm trying to do, and this speaks to something else an editor once told me, is just listen very carefully. Mm-hmm. He had described that listening was a lost art or a dying art. Maybe it is a lost art. I don't know. But, and I've come to find that during the course of an interview, somebody may say something, just like that provides a little, like, it's like they crack open a window and there's something fascinating beyond, or there might be, it's potentially a road to something more interesting. And so often I'm trying to listen very carefully in interviews, for that moment. They might say something unexpected, interesting, that's a window into another world. And I might ask, then take the interview in a different direction, and there might be nothing there. But I have this kind of fear that if I'm not listening closely enough, I'm going to miss that, and that I'll miss a great story because of it. So that's a very long-winded answer, but the way of I've had several great editors who have, I take their lessons to heart when it comes to, whether it's listening or low-hanging fruit or just the idea of stories being all around you or the story hunting mindset, all of that. I take all of that into consideration, and it's very, very important to me.
What's the best thing you've read lately?
Oh boy, that is a great question. I'm a huge David Grann fan. I think like sentence for sentence that he's the best nonfiction writer in America. So his recent piece in the New Yorker on the explorer who traversed the Antarctic, I thought was remarkable. His stories are always just such incredible journeys themselves, and the characters are so incredibly fascinating. And his book Killers of the Flower Moon is amazing. The other story that I read recently that I'd plug on here was, I think it's Kingdom of Dust or Kingdom from Dust, but in California Sunday, about the largest farmer in America in California. And that story was, I won't be surprised if it's nominated for or wins a National Magazine Award at some point. It is a remarkable feat of journalism that's, maybe like the grand stories, like 20,000 words, but is just so captivating and hard to put down, which is, again, for a story that length is really something.
Cool. I can recommend, I just finished a book last week called Lost Almost. It's a novel by writer Amy Knight, her first novel. And it's really short. I think it's less than 200 pages. It's about a physicist, and a fictional physicist who worked in Los Alamos, and his family, and kind of like all like various different stories around his family. And it was one of those books, I haven't had this in a long time, where the world that was created and the writing and the characters, it was so good, I read it slow because I didn't want it to end. I usually read pretty quick, and this was one where I forced myself to kind of dole it out almost day by day because I didn't want it was such a short book, I didn't want it to end. It's just a great, great book. So I would recommend that one if you're looking for it's an easy read, but it's a very compelling one. So if you're looking for fiction, I can recommend that.
That's great. No, I know exactly what you mean when you're talking about writing like that. I feel that way about Gran, Colson Whitehead, Michael Paternity, Pam Koloff. There's a lot of, Catherine Schultz, the New Yorker, any of her stories, I almost don't want them to end. And I find myself reading them more slowly to study the way that they construct, a sentence, or, the way they choose certain verbs to describe action, or the way that they construct certain scenes. There's certain, it's, it's really humbling to read work like that. I mean, it shows, I guess in the basketball sense, like, I could be like an okay 3-point shooter, but then you see Steph Curry and it just totally, that's like a whole other world. And it feels that way sometimes, like when you're reading some of these people that I'm talking about, it's just, they are on such a high level. But yeah, it's worth savoring and studying their writing for sure.
Baxter, if people want to follow you and see what else your next stories, where's the best place to do so?
Sure. So just ESPN.com. My Twitter handle is it's really simple. It's my first name, @Baxter, Baxter. That's a good place to find it. And I guess Google, right? If you're interested in my work, you could probably find it there.
Awesome. Well, this has been a great conversation. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, man. I really appreciate it.
As always, thanks for listening to The Other 51. You can find show notes for this episode and all our episodes at sportsmediaguy.com on the Other 51 tab. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. I can highly recommend Overcast for this. Our theme music is by Ellie Moritz.